Today's episode of The Debrief centers around 4 conversations that are all more connected than they might seem at first glance. Jackie and I talk about the controversy unfolding in Seneca Falls after Town Supervisor Frank Schmitter's arrest following an altercation with another board member. We get into the growing budget pressures facing municipalities across the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. We talk about why dissolution keeps getting pitched as a catch-all solution for struggling communities, even though it rarely addresses the underlying problems. And we dig into the bigger issues sitting underneath all of it: energy infrastructure, affordability, and the reality that New York State is eventually going to have to confront the utility model head on. None of these conversations exist in a vacuum. Headlines about elected officials behaving badly aren't uncommon anymore. Neither are headlines about budget crises, tax increases, shrinking populations, or communities struggling to maintain basic services. We start with the open letter I wrote this week on Substack about Seneca Falls, and really about the broader challenge facing a lot of local governments right now. Because the truth is, there are a lot of good people in these communities doing good work every day. People running businesses, volunteering, organizing events, working for local government, trying to make these places better. But eventually, communities reach a point where avoiding hard decisions becomes its own decision. And that's really what this conversation is about. Seneca Falls deserves better. A lot of communities do. The question is whether local leadership is willing or able to make the difficult choice required to actually change course. In light of what we've seen over the last week and a half from Seneca Falls, I'm curious, as another outsider, what your perspective is on everything that's happened and sort of that broader view of 10 years of this.
Well, first, let me just acknowledge, I think it's very charitable of you to say it's only been 10 years. Because I remember back when I was on city council, which was generations ago, that we often used to say, well, at least we're not Seneca Falls in terms of behavior. But, we'll leave that to people who would like to read up on the history and current happenings in more detail. But I do think it speaks to the general sense of maybe disappointment and disconnect that I think regionally a lot of people are feeling with their municipal governments, because the Finger Lakes is a gem. The people are wonderful. I agree with you. A lot of good things are happening. And yet it seems like the elected officials lack a level of professionalism and seriousness. I think that, for me, is the takeaway. It's not the disappointment I feel when I read headlines like that, or when I watch a Geneva City Council meeting, right, or hear about things going on in Auburn or other communities as well, who are all kind of facing similar issues. It's that the elected officials are so unserious, and that is, and again, not all elected officials, unfortunately. It feels like it's most, but not everybody. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but we are in serious times, right? And I don't mean that to be scary or anything like that, but just the industries, the tourism industry, the landfilling pressures, the other environmental challenges, the infrastructure stuff, the budgeting. We're going to talk a bit more about some of the state pressures. This is a time for focused, serious, meaningful discussion. And instead, we're just getting a lot of this knee-jerk, from the gut, machismo kind of loud talking with a real lack of substance. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate.
It's operational dysfunction.
Yeah.
Combined with a clear inability to do the day-to-day stuff well. like the day-to-day functions of government, of municipal operation. I'm talking about what runs a municipality. The day-to-day stuff is not getting done well or done correctly.
Well, and that's where I think it's important to kind of separate. Again, Seneca Falls is in a unique position because, the town board is supposed to be doing, I think, a lot more of the day-to-day oversight, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, everyone's got, let me say this, the municipal staff in these communities are the only things keeping these things going, right? Because the elected officials themselves have not proven capable of, like you said, the operational day-to-day administration. Now, in some places, I mentioned Auburn before, Canandaigua, Geneva, with a council manager form of government, the elected officials aren't supposed to be doing the day-to-day operations, and we can see what happens when they think they should be, and then things start to run askew of good practice. But, some of the towns where the supervisor or the mayor is kind of the chief executive officer, the executive functions leave a little to be desired.
Leadership. Yeah. It's the lacking in leadership.
Right.
And I hear what you're saying about staff are really the ones that are carrying the load. And maybe there is the expectation that in quote unquote small towns, although I don't really think that when you're a town like Seneca Falls and you have a budget as large as Seneca Falls does with the number of services that you provide, you can really call yourself a small town in the traditional sense. Every municipality has the opportunity to hire whatever staff they choose to hire or want to run their community however they want to. Again, it's that operational dysfunction is the baseline.
Yes.
Which combined with a lack of leadership, I think I'm thinking back to a conversation I had on one of my old shows with Matt Horn a billion years ago, where he described it in the Geneva scenario, where it's like your city manager, your town manager has to manage and run the municipality 28 days out of the month, and then your board or your electeds have to do it 2 days.
Right.
But you have to do it well those 2 days. And if you don't, the repercussions from that,
yes.
Or if, to put a really fine point on it here, Seneca Falls, had it made better personnel choices over the last 8 years, probably could have avoided a lot of the issues that were pointed out in audits between 2019 and 2024, some of the infighting that we've seen between departments and whatnot over the years. All of those things, I think, could have been fixed by just a few small decisions compared to the big picture. But when not even those things are being done, and it's all just allowed to sort of keep roiling and keep building and building and building, and to put this point on it too, it's not all that dissimilar from how we've seen the town handle the landfill. Kicking the can down the road, not making a decision. Take what decision you want to make out of the equation, not making consistent decisions that you can point to and be like, this is where we stand. It's all a different version of, or a different flavor of, in every one of these situations of just, we don't really want to make the hard choice, so we'll just kind of punt on it and see what happens.
Yeah.
And this is what happens.
And that, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. I mean, it's, no one's minding the store. And what happens when no one's minding the store, right? And to your point, Seneca Falls, although it may seem like a small town, has major industrial forces working upon it in a way that it can't afford to be a rinky-dink show when it comes to governing. Like, someone has to be on top of managing what's happening, because otherwise all these things just happen to you, and they happen to the people of the community who are expecting that there will be some buffer, some interface, somebody who is actually steering the ship. And whether they agree with the direction or not, at least aligning protocols and policies to move in a particular direction. And instead, I mean, watch one of the meetings, and I know we're going to pivot to Geneva in a bit too, when you get the sense that it's essentially a free-for-all of competitive personalities who are just struggling to be seen and heard and not focused on the nuts and bolts of governing, which is a boring, when done well, boring practice. The showmanship is what's landing us in a whole boatload of trouble. Just to take my boat and nautical analogies to the full.
You went all the way with it there.
Yes.
So you mentioned Geneva, and you mentioned a couple of the other communities that we're going to talk about here next with budgeting, the challenges of budgeting. I wrote a piece, I think it was last week, I can't remember now, spotlighting basically the three communities that have been in the headlines the last month or month and a half about budget issues: Canandaigua, Auburn, and of course your favorite, Geneva. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on just sort of the idea around a budget crisis. You're probably going to look at this more through the lens of just Geneva, and that's totally fine. But I'm curious, just when you hear budget crisis, where does that bring you in terms of how you're thinking about the way that elected body is probably operating?
So I think it's very difficult to call something a crisis when it is the predictable, obvious outgrowth of policies that everybody knew were going to lead to the fiscal conditions that currently obtain. Mm-hmm. So to me, crisis, maybe I don't understand the word. To me, crisis sounds like surprise, unexpected situation, it needing immediate management. I just feel like, no kidding, like we have all these municipalities have the budget that they have brought themselves to over time. And if they want to call it a crisis now, it's only because they weren't paying attention. And I really feel, and I thought you did a really great job in one of your columns kind of explaining that the inflationary pressures, the personnel pressures, the retirement contribution pressures, these fixed costs, which continue to increase year over year, healthcare, et cetera, if I didn't already say that. But these costs are things that municipalities who took seriously a 3 or 5 year planning process years ago saw coming, mm-hmm. had multiple choice points along the way, and again, had elected officials who either decided see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, right? Kick it down the line, or maybe didn't believe it or didn't understand it. But I think in all of the communities that you were writing about, Auburn, Canandaigua, Newark, Geneva, this had been flagged by staff in audits, in other financial modeling for years. And again, yes, taking Geneva as an example, the idea, watching these meetings and seeing the guys come to the table and wave their arms, this is a crisis and we got to get our hands on it, around it, really quickly, makes me think, imagine this was your household and you had accumulated debt, you knew you were spending above your means for a while, and then all of a sudden your parents burst into the room screaming and crying that they're in an emergency. Why approach it that way, right? That's, I guess, my critique is in the what I would call unmoderated crisis speak that raises the issue in a way that doesn't help to find a good solution.
And I will say, I think there's a difference between the news assigning crisis as the label to it and the elected representatives calling it that themselves,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Because I think that's the big difference between Auburn and Geneva. Auburn is, it's been categorized as that by the Citizen and the reporters who are actually covering that, day in and day out.
Right.
Whereas in Geneva, it seems to be a thing that's being spoken more by folks who are in the decision-making cycle. It's like the endless deferred decisions. No one wants to be the one that makes a decision that someone, we don't even know who, someone might not like, because that's that, everybody seems to be on pins and needles 24/7 about upsetting some constituent along the way. But at the end of the day, it's the common theme. We're going to talk about the Village of Addison and their dissolution in a couple minutes here. But all these one-time fixes where you pull a little bit from reserve to cover this so that you don't have to make any hard decisions on the personnel side. The reality that home ownership is declining in every one of those cities we mentioned, population's declining for the most part. And at the end of the day, the tax base is getting smaller. And as the tax base gets smaller and population declines, unfortunately, I was just having a conversation a couple days ago with someone who, was trying to make the argument to me that, if population declines, the police department should definitely be able to shrink because crime is going to be less. And the data just doesn't really support that, because typically when communities shrink, they get poorer. And when they get poorer, typically more petty crime, property crime ends up happening. So there is that at least perceived feeling from those in power, and even the folks who are working in law enforcement, that, wait, we're having to respond to more stuff, not less stuff. What's going on here? So it's just one of those situations where growth is the fix, growth is the solution. More people living in your community is the fix to everything that we're talking, all the problems. But this systemic failure has been 30 years running.
Yes.
In every one of these communities. We'll just get through the next year. We'll just get through the next year. We'll just get through the next year. And fast forward to present day, and all of a sudden, there are municipalities, and I believe it's Auburn. Auburn and Cayuga County are in this really precarious situation where the county also is facing a pretty steep budget crisis itself, where there's going to be a pretty hefty tax levy increase coming up. And then you've got the city as well. So city residents are probably going to get hit twice. But again, it's all of the same stuff. And yes, I know some communities have said they are pro-housing communities, and they have done their declarations. They have submitted their documentation to the state, and the state has bestowed that honor upon them. But that doesn't actually mean you're fixing the problem.
Right.
You have to actually build housing if you want to be pro-housing. You have to actually grow your population if you want to get the results of that, if you want to see the benefit of it. And, there, at this point, I think the biggest takeaway for me, especially after writing that piece, was that there aren't any painless solutions left. They're all going to hurt. Every single option that's on the table now for these municipalities that are, staring down, 10, 15, 20, 30% tax increases potentially in the next couple of years, with more likely in the years that follow that, without major structural change. It's just the reality that people are going to have to live with.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think to your earlier point about good leadership being key is that people are able to understand these things if they're given good information. And the problem that we see when there are these kind of fiscal gaps that need to be filled in some way and decisions that need to be made is exactly the point you just said about every decision will hurt. So you have to be able to communicate with people that, all right, this is a pivot point. We can't put it off any longer. We got to rip the Band-Aid off and do something. But the reason I think many communities fail at that messaging is the people delivering it just really want to be liked, and they don't know, they don't have the internal fortitude to withstand somebody saying, well, I don't like that, and being able to say, you know what, I don't like it either, but this is kind of where we're at. Again, I don't mean to make everything about city government into like a parenting analogy, but I still say if we had a panel of single parents, these decisions would get made and people would actually feel like they understood and were okay with it, because that's just how you have to make the budget work. But so the leadership and the messaging is kind of the first problem. The second problem is when it comes to picking out of the painful options, which one will we pursue? That needs to be, and you kind of mentioned it just briefly, it needs to be a data-driven decision. So you were saying, well, the perception is this, but the reality is that. And unfortunately, when elections and governing are more a popularity contest than actual, effective leadership, data-driven decision-making goes out the window because perception rules the day. And if we keep living in this world of reactive perception, we are going to continue to see unsustainably crafted budgets and a continued fiscal decline. We are at the precipice of the fiscal cliff, and my worry is some of these communities don't have the wherewithal in their elected officials to say, I understand what people say they want, but the data says, the research says, community success is actually over here, and we need to move that way. And I know someone's going to say, you've offered no specifics. Let me give a specific example just to help. And again, sorry, it's going to be Geneva because that's what I follow most closely, right? But for example, Geneva says, oh my goodness, we're facing this crisis. Let us articulate our priorities. And the priorities are so divorced from the actual data and reality. And it says, here are our constraints. We're absolutely not going to touch our major cost drivers. But instead, what's on the table? Recreation, planning and economic development, the things we consider the fluff. And if you look at any research on successful communities that don't invest in the things that make you a community of choice mean you aren't going to get the population growth. You aren't going to have that robust community that in the long term pulls you out of the crisis, if you want to call it a crisis. And it's just like, I don't know, I'm full of cliches tonight, right? Like if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging, right? That's the cliche. And I see, oh my goodness, the messaging coming out is, nope, we are committed to continuing digging. In fact, let's speed up our digging because that's what the people want.
And that's even, to your point, it's even more important that elected decision makers be on top of their game, the onus be on them, because we've seen examples in communities across the whole region where everybody does get on the same page and everyone is working towards the same goal. And there are issues or challenges above them, above their level of that require all of them to be on the same page just to meet the challenge that exists at that next stage, to just get past the start line, right? Like you've got to be ready for the next challenge. the other thing that stands out after listening to you talk about that is it's really funny. Cities are insulated in a way that smaller municipalities, towns particularly, just aren't because of staff and the robust staff that cities have to make sure that execution is happening properly. Where in smaller communities, unfortunately, you are relying as much as I do agree fundamentally, the onus is on elected officials. In a lot of municipalities, being an elected official is at best a part-time gig,
Right.
or at worst some volunteerism, where you're showing up once a month or twice a month for an hour, a couple times, and that's it. It's hard to imagine a scenario in my mind where towns are able to dig themselves out of these types of holes that we're talking about, which, if just because we're talking about 3 cities, I think part of the reason why I mentioned them or used them as examples was because I think in most ways they're the most robust. Mm-hmm. They're the most able to absorb all of the things that all the negative things that we're talking about.
For the city staff, because
Right.
for them, it would be worse.
Well, and to my point, that's when it comes for a town,
Right.
it doesn't have that.
Right.
It's going to be much worse. It's going to be much more of a challenge to overcome it. And you arrive at the massive tax increase much more quickly in a small town than you do in a city where you have more people trying to figure out how to make right a little bit here and a little bit there and whatever the case may be. But let's keep talking about sort of the problems and the solutions. In particular, this perceived solution that drives me up a wall. I have talked about dissolution so many times in this studio, now with so many different people that I just really quite tired of hearing about it. The village of Addison in Steuben County is going through the dissolution process. And I mean, they are having the conversation, holding the public meetings to flesh out whether it is a viable solution. I'm reading between the lines, and I am looking at what they have stated publicly so far and what the meetings have looked like. They're headed toward dissolution.
Okay.
My prediction there is they will dissolve.
I do think once a community gets to the point of commissioning the study,
Right. It's a wrap.
they already kind of know that they're doing it. But I mean, I'm not disparaging them. I'm sure it is still a transparent process. I'm just saying, I agree with you on your prediction here.
I think the process actually is a pretty transparent process. I don't think that's the issue.
Right.
And we've talked about the issues with the dissolution process in New York State before, not having the town adequately involved, the town that absorbs the village not actually having to adhere to any part of the plan that is even voted on or approved by the village or its residents. But the bigger hook here for me is this idea that dissolving local government is going to somehow solve the systemic problems, many of which we just talked about, in one fell swoop, without growth, without addressing the systemic issues. And reading the feedback from, particularly on Facebook, because that's where it's easiest to find feedback on these kinds of things, many of the people who are talking about dissolution favorably, much like it mirrors, what I've seen over the last 15 years in other communities that have dissolved. There's this assumption that if you just eliminate a layer of bureaucracy, a layer of administration, it's going to unlock everything, and we're going to be freed. And it's going to take off. But if you just look at the data around the village of Addison, the town of Addison, Steuben County in general, if you're outside of essentially Hornell, growth isn't happening.
Right.
Okay? School districts are shrinking, communities are shrinking, poverty outpaces the state, income lags in the state compared to the state. All of the data points to a community that is just in decline. And at the end of the day, when you dissolve, you're just speeding that decline up. Because then, I look at the villages across the state that have won the $4.5 million for the New York Forward, the almost DRI,
Right.
the almost DRI
light.
program.
Yes.
Villages have won those. The village of Webster won it. I watched that process very closely. I lived there. Once you eliminate yourself, you can't put the ketchup back in the bottle, right? And it isn't going to change the systemic stuff that's happening in these communities. It's not going to make people decide, oh my God, they dissolved the village, I'll move to Addison.
Right.
That's not happening. There isn't a developer who's sitting in Buffalo or sitting in Jamestown or wherever developers sit in the southern tier to decide where they're going to put their apartment complexes, saying,
thank goodness, finally.
Yeah, the village is gone. We can build.
Move in.
We can do it now.
Right.
And it's just not the way it works.
Right.
And to think that such a simplistic fix is going to override all of these other issues. And also, not for nothing, village government, there's this other thing, and it's half conspiracy, it's half just people not knowing how government works or what their government costs them. There's this idea that, well, the mayor's not going to be getting paid, the trustees aren't going to be getting paid, the village administrator's not, the clerk's not going to be getting. You're talking about a total payroll of probably like $100,000 through the whole thing, and the mayor's probably making like $2,000.
Right.
City councilors in Geneva make what? $4,000?
$4,000. Yeah.
$4,000 a year in one of the 3 largest municipalities in the entire Finger Lakes region. No one's getting rich off local government, except for the contractors, I suppose, and developers and some of the folks who do work to grow some of these communities. Point being, you're not going to see some massive saving because your village dissolves. You're not going to see some crazy growth happen because your village dissolves. You're just going to continue down the line doing exactly what you've always done, and that's really the only outcome you're going to have. Because no one in the history of dissolution has ever approached dissolving a village like creating or building a new municipality entirely.
Right.
Which is exactly how it
Which is what it's
right?
supposed to do, though. I mean, let me play devil's advocate, because I'm worried that the takeaway from this discussion is going to be dissolution conversations are not useful or effective. And I am one of the people who actually thinks there are some cases in which mergers or consolidations, aka dissolution of one entity, could be very effective. But I think, to your point, what we've seen are cases of dissolution where it's being tried as like, wow, things have gotten bad, we've got to do something, how about this? And it's not being approached from the perspective, which I think maybe could work, of we have 2 adjacent entities, each of which has something to offer the planning or economic development future of this region, and it would be more efficient for us to be consolidating those efforts so that we can do a logical, sensible, fact-based, data-driven plan for a municipality that is well-functioning. I think that's the idea behind the allowance for this kind of dissolution or consolidation. And I think that there are cases, and I can think of one immediately, which I'll keep to myself, where it could work really well. But I don't think those are the jurisdictions that think they need it, because nobody thinks they need it till it's too late for it to be effective, if that makes sense. And I think that's what we're seeing. Like Steuben County, like you said, dissolution does not hold the key to their economic future. Could it help? Only if, like you said, it is retooled as part of how are we going to restart things in a better, more sensible, manageable way. but people don't want to go back to square one because they kind of like the way it's usually been working.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate to your devil's
Good.
advocate.
All right, good.
The mechanisms for shared services in New York State is a far better tool to do exactly what you're describing without dissolving anything, and it's far more comprehensive than the dissolution process.
Yes.
Shared services, virtually all of the shared service initiatives in New York State require both municipalities to be equal players in the process.
Yes.
Dissolution, the town is essentially not involved. They can be involved, but they aren't involved until the deed is done.
Right, right. And I think to your point, and I agree. So I'm glad you raised that because, I think some people, again, I've said this before, and sorry to sound like a broken record, but a lot of people who complain about how high the taxes are say, "Oh, I'm going to move to Tennessee. I'm going to, move somewhere where the taxes are lower." And if you look at the way, in my view, a major difference between those areas and our own is that in those states, they can annex, which in New York State you cannot do. So this dissolution process is this strange hybrid that doesn't give any of the powers that would be effective, but doesn't give any of the voice that would be effective either. So, it'd be one thing if a village said, look, we can already provide all these services. We're just going to absorb this area. Yeah. We're going to annex it.
Yep.
Then it's like, okay, here's our plan. Here's what we're going to do. And we're going to implement that. Instead, New York wants everybody to have a seat at the table and talk it through, but without any parameters for accountability for what has been negotiated. So to your point, I agree with you. The shared services structure allows that. The current dissolution structure does not. The missing piece is an annexation law, which I think would benefit New York State.
Well, and to your point, I also think that dissolution, I don't think dissolution was intended to be the first lever that's pulled.
Right.
Shared services are intended to be the first levers that are pulled. Dissolution, I think, is intended to be like a last-ditch effort.
Right.
You're in a tight spot. Like
you're going to end up in receivership, right? Like yes.
Yeah, you're between a rock and a hard place, and you have to make some sort of decision. And I think in that scenario, or the imagined scenario, is not a lot of services are being retained, or not a lot of services that aren't already offered by the town are being retained, or the larger entity that the smaller is being rolled into, but that isn't how we're seeing it approached. Right. To your point, I think we're going to see a lot of consolidation in New York State over the next 10 to 15 years, just out of sheer necessity, taking all of the decline that we've talked about, combined with the financial pressures, and just the reality around, providing the services that people do, in fact, need. I think we're going to see a lot of consolidation of smaller municipalities. I think counties are going to be providing a lot more services that were previously offered by towns. And I also think we're going to see a lot of consolidation of school districts. It's funny because just last week, I was on the golf course and I overheard a conversation among some folks that I most definitely would not have considered to be county school supporters, and they were talking about exactly that.
Interesting.
And I think we are just sort of barreling towards a reality that people are starting to understand that you have services that have to be provided. You have, especially with schools, municipalities too, though, you have people who need to benefit. Like you have a clear need that needs to be filled, and the smallest of the entities that exist cannot adequately fill the gaps or provide the services as on the trajectory they are currently on. So unless something wild and crazy happens with population in the next 3 to 5 years, I think fate's sort of determined for what most upstate municipalities are going to look like. I think there will be a lot of molding together.
I feel like that is an incredibly optimistic view. that makes me feel like a cynic, because I actually, while I think there should be more shared services consolidations, probably dissolutions, which again, I would prefer to be annexations, but we can't do that. I actually think, going back to our initial point about governance, leadership, and kind of community direction, I'm kind of worried that what we're seeing play out in these municipalities is so much territorialism and parochial kind of short-sightedness that I'm worried that in the next 10 years, we're just going to see more and more municipalities kind of run aground into that fiscal crisis because they refuse to do some of the things that seem intolerable for reasons of just stubborn individuality and need to keep feeling relevant. Like, I guess I look around at some of the guys in government and I think they're not going to give up their ability to go to the grocery store and say, hey, I'm in charge of this, even if it's in the best interest of their community.
Here's what I'll say to that.
So you just gave me a feeling like, actually, maybe we're far more enlightened than I thought.
Here's what I'll say to that. A long time ago, I sat down with a superintendent in this studio who told me school districts should be thinking about merging with other districts around them now, while they can dictate the course before the state decides for them.
Same thing. Yes.
It is the exact same thing.
Yes.
At some point, it's not going to be up to the local electeds. And people, I know there's going to be plenty of people in my inbox now that I've spoken the words out loud, who say home rule, who say, point to all the things in the state's constitution. All of that gets thrown out the window when we're talking about the ability of municipalities to function.
Right.
And when you can no longer raise taxes to pay the bills and provide the services, and you still need the services to be provided because, quality of life cannot erode to a point where, it looks like another country in New York State or in parts of New York State. The state will step in and make hard decisions for you. You're not going to find a manual for it anywhere but they will do it, and you won't be the one making the decisions about how that looks. It's just a necessary reality, because people aren't, the state's not going to watch municipalities literally shrivel up and die with the people inside them.
Right.
It's just not gonna happen.
I'm hoping, I'm gonna leave today's podcast hoping that the wisdom can prevail, and so that we don't get to that kind of worst case scenario.
Hopefully it can. All right, last topic for the day. We're gonna wrap things up here with something we both love talking about: electricity.
Nice egg.
Nice egg, Argini. So I wrote a column a few days ago. Basically, I took one of Nice Egg and Argini's recent press releases, which argued for the rate increase that they are calling for in their current rate case, which would, it's around about like 30-ish% increase in cost. And for me, after writing it, after reading it, after continuing to, outside of Finger Lakes One, I work in this space where I talk to different people who are having to deal with the utilities on a daily basis, and they're making the case. The power companies, all of them, not just Nice Egg and Argini, they're making the best case for public utility ever.
Absolutely.
Every time they open their mouths and talk about how they can't afford to upgrade their service lines, even though their transmission line and service lines and substations in a lot of cases across upstate New York are 70 to 80 plus years old and will cost tens of millions of dollars to fix. And the math just doesn't work on their end. Every time they say that, they're just making the case that electricity, gas, that type of utility should not be in the for-profit model.
Absolutely.
Period.
Absolutely.
End of
And
story.
okay, we're about to be called electricity socialists, I'm sure. But the fact of the matter is, when these companies tell you that what's causing the price increase is a transition to more green infrastructure, I mean, please, how gullible do they think we are that we can't see that the reason that costs are increasing is because rather than, as you said, making investments in upgrading transmission lines, increasing capacity, responding to trends and data that tells them where those investments need to be made and when, their focus has been on profit,
Yeah.
on making sure that the multinational company that is the parent organization of both companies that give us the illusion of some kind of choice is as profitable as can be, not based in America, right? And just extracting money. Meanwhile, lobbying the state and the federal government for more projects that will increase demand, like data centers, and allow them to continue passing those costs on to the residential customers. So the business sector and the electricity supply sector are doing what works best for them, knowing that the residential customer is going to pick up the bill, and then messaging in such a way that the residential customers, rather than directing their ire and their attention and their demand for change back on the industry, somehow take all their anger and direct it at state regulators and green enterprises, which are actually the only things that could affect what's going on right now. So it's just, to me, I watch it and I just think, man, that is some very effective political manipulation on behalf of the energy companies.
The companies get, if you're going to take away one thing from, I said this to a couple of readers who reached out to me afterward. If you're going to take one thing away from that column, it's this: these companies get to operate with either unusually low or almost no risk.
Right.
Right. It's the cost of service model where the infrastructure, the building, everything, it all gets folded into your bill as a customer. You pay it back, and the shareholders are guaranteed their return no matter what.
Yep.
And typically it exceeds the return because of that cost of service structure. So it's this, it's billed by the power companies as this: we are a part of the community, we are doing our share, but all the deferrals, all the maintenance that's been kicked down the road, all of the build out that's been kicked down the road. The power companies are really primarily incentivized to add new customers and build more rather than maintain what they have, because cost of service, more customers, more revenue,
Yep.
more return. Again, it just doesn't match up. So to me, I hope people really focus on the cost of service model, because that really is where the issue is. New York State could fix that in a heartbeat if they chose to.
Yes.
Doesn't seem like they want to. I also, another thing that just kind of bothers me on a personal level, and why would I expect this kind of contextualization from the power companies who are out, basically patting themselves on the back for spending, $34 million to fix this substation or make this substation better, or, $72 million to do this here. They never contextualize the spending, right? You never hear what the total spend is over a span of years, and it wasn't that long ago. I was sitting down and doing the math with a couple people, and it's if you take all of the customers that NYSEG and RG&E has, and it's a very large service area, and you take all of the infrastructure spend that they've touted along the way, it essentially maths out to $1 per customer per year. That's what the investment is from NYSEG and RG&E back into the grid. $1 per customer per year.
Right.
So
And
your bill has probably doubled in the last decade or so. Your power bill has probably doubled in the last decade or so. But don't worry, RG&E and NYSEG have put $1 back in for you every year.
Yeah, it's so ridiculous, and it frustrates me to no end because every minute somebody spends railing against a wind turbine or a solar installation or the governor's climate law or whatever is a minute that NYSEG has convinced you to take your eye off the regulations that would change their business model and decrease your actual residential energy cost. And they are just master manipulators of their messaging. And people have fallen for it. And they know, particularly in Upstate, they have convinced people to lobby against things that would hurt the power company and to completely ignore the things that would actually be in the residents' best interest in terms of transmission and municipalities, right? Because we're talking about the need for growth. Mm-hmm. What is one of the things constraining growth? You did a great job shining a spotlight on the fact that electrical capacity and lack of investment is constraining town, village, city abilities to grow their residential populations. And yet we can't get the residents to argue or fight for that. But instead, we can get them all up in arms about green technology, which, again, that's exactly what the power company wants you focused on.
They have massive press and media teams.
Yep.
They lobby as well as any industry ever. And then they are able to also essentially, hold the carrot out in front of municipalities and say, if you get too loud, we just won't prioritize you guys. Right. And that's it's really unfortunate because the only entity that can save, customers, residents from paying an absolute fortune for their utility bills is the state through meaningful change, like you said. And that's it. I think that's just it. We ruined all the optimism we had going there.
No. But the optimistic note is please pay attention to Public Service Commission and its rate hearings and participate in those about your bills and actually blame the industry and not these accessory things that the industry is telling you to get mad about.
Yeah. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of the show. If you are looking for more, Jackie's Doing the Right Thing runs in the Finger Lakes Times on Tuesdays, and my column in Focus is published there, as well as over on Substack. If you want to get in touch with the show, the email is debrief@fingerlakes1.com. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.